Okay, I guess it's afternoon. So, welcome to my talk. It's been a while since I've stood in front of an audience since the lockdown. A bit about myself, I'm from South Africa. I'm a game developer, I'm a web developer as well, but I'm actually a lover of tech all in all. So, basically, my talk today, I'm going to be just talking about game development in Python using a library called Pygame, esports, and competitive gaming. So, are there any gamers in the house? Any gamers? One, two. Okay, so there's not quite a lot of gamers, right? So let me talk about today's agenda. So today I'm going to be talking about obviously the introductions, introducing myself. I'll be talking about what is a game, the world of gaming, Python programming, and as well as Pygame. What is game architecture? What is game development? What is game design, esports, competitive gaming, and eventually, how does the future look for gamers, right? So a little bit about myself. I am an instructor, I'm a facilitator, so I teach as well students how to build a first Python game using Pygame, as well as I've got some certifications in terms of esports business, as well as educational background. So a bit about myself, I am a founder of a small tech company startup called Billionaire Developers. So basically, this basically means is that my aim is to actually help young people or even beginners to actually get into coding, but not only just coding, but actually going into game development as a whole. I've got a BSc in computer science and mathematics. I'm a senior game developer, a senior software engineer. I've been in the industry for about 6 to 8 years. I've been also part of Microsoft Gold Student Ambassadors. I'm part of Google's developers as a co-lead. But guys, this is not about me, right? I can go on and on about myself. So today, I want to talk about what exactly is game development. So let's take a step back and actually ask ourselves, what is a definition of a game? Like, what is the premise of what a game is all about? So basically, a game is an activity that one actually engages in either for amusement or for fun. But we've seen over the years that gaming has also been introduced into education as well. So we have something called edutech, right? But essentially, it is an episode or a series of episodes, right? So from like we have level 1, level 2, level 3, and so forth. But essentially, a game has to have a beginning, and it essentially has to have an ending, right? You can never have an endless game and that goes on and on and on and on. But a game also has to have someone that is willing to learn or actually spark some engagement, right? So because you don't want to play a game that is way too difficult because you're not going to be able to continue playing the game. And you don't want to have a game that's way too easy that will finish the game in like 2 minutes, all right? But essentially, anything that is electrical, right, and that's interactive, and also it sparks amusement can be called as, can be deprived as a definition of a game, right? So now let's look at the world of gaming. Now the first things I want to talk about is the pros and the cons, right? The advantages and the disadvantages of what gaming is. Now the first thing about the advantages of gaming is that it makes you very social. You meet new people, you meet new friends online, you guys compete, exchange information and so forth. It also enhances eye and hand coordination as well as response time. Now this is quite a very interesting one, especially for parents when they ask me is gaming really good for my child? It is a yes and a no question because, answers, because as I said, it does enhance eye and hand coordination. But in the long term, it does actually then go into fatigue and body strains, which is actually a drawback. But now we've also seen that gaming is not only a multi-billion, but is a multi-trillion-dollar industry, especially after the COVID pandemic that we all faced. Right, so some of the downfalls of gaming is that it doesn't come cheap. As much as obviously we all play online, but you actually need to have some quite adequate and it's quite expensive for the software as well as the hardware. Now let's look at the types of games that we usually have. Right, so typically most of us know games like CSGO, which is a first-person shooting games. We have sporting games such as FIFA, rugby, tennis. Then we have multi-online battling games. So this is like your Dota 2 and so forth. But we have a plethora of other games as well, right? So we have things like role play, which is typically like The Sims, or simulation games and so forth. We have adventure games such as Counter-Strike and so forth. So for some of you guys are wondering yourselves, okay, for beginners, what is Python? But obviously this is a Python talk, so predominantly of you should know what Python is all about. But Python basically is not just a programming language, right? Python is actually an interactive, object-oriented, high-level programming language which actually has dynamic semantics. What that means is that it's quite easy to learn the syntax. It's quite cheap, it's free actually, very easy to maintain, and it supports multiple modules and packages, which enables programs to create modular programming and code reuse. So now what is Pygame? Right? So Pygame basically is a cross-platform for Python modules designed for writing computer games. Right? So it includes computer graphics, as well as sound libraries that actually help us to actually create a fully fledged game. Now these are the type of games that you actually can create as a beginner with zero amount of code, right? So this is typically what we would call a 2D or an arcade game, right? You can create a game like Snake, you can create a game like Tetris, Pac-Man, and so forth. So for some people that are quite avid gamers, this might seem a bit boring, but in terms of game development, this is the first step that you actually want to step into before moving into the 3D kind of stuff, which I'll be talking about later. So now let's jump into the more technical and the more complicated thing. So what is game architecture? So for example, if we take how a building obviously manifests, the first thing we actually have to do is have an architect, right? So what does an architect typically do in a day-to-day basis? We have something called the blueprint, right? So the blueprint actually helps us to actually maneuver and how the game is supposed to be working. So we have something called the game logic and the game view. So I'll be talking about what game logic and game view actually work in hand, but then you then have the game architecture, application layer, and then you have the hardware and the software. Don't worry, if this is a bit complicated, I will go into deeper space. Now, let me talk about the properties and the components of what game architecture actually comprises. The first thing is about space. Space is quite important when it comes to game architecture, because you actually need to decipher in terms of the gameplay and how your game setting is going to look like. So for example, if I'm trying to build a stadium, the stadium obviously is the first things first, the whole surrounding, that is what the space is going to look like. We have things like the surrounding track, we have the middle section where there's probably shot put, and all of these different kind of conversations. If I look at a stadium like for soccer, for instance, the space will obviously be the whole stadium, how the field looks like, how the seats look like. And then we also go into construction. So these are the things that actually fill up the minute spaces within the space, right? So if I look at a building or like a hotel, obviously the first thing I need to think about is it has to have rooms, bathrooms, and so forth. This is what the construction actually comes into play. Then we have something called the material. So the material in terms of what exactly is being involved in terms of our space and construction. Lighting is quite important, right? So lighting and emotions actually go hand in hand. Because if I give you an example of, if I walk into a room and it's got a wide space and it's got bright lighting, your mood generally, it feels calm, right? You feel much ease. But if I put you in a room that's quite dark, that has a small, narrow, and it's got a lighting at the end, you're actually creating suspense, right? So it's quite important to actually play with the player's emotions, so that obviously you want to keep your player engaged at all times, right? So now what is game development, right? So game development is basically the process of just developing the game as a whole, right? It's the effort of what the developers come together and actually now create what the development of the game is. So this is basically what we call the brain of the game, right? But essentially game developers can depending obviously on the project and on the team, game developers can obviously range from either a single developer or actually a team of developers, which actually they will be producing games like for computers and mobiles, as well as for devices, right? So you also have to have some sort of creative, or they use creative visuals to actually make sure that the game has certain features and functionality as well. Right, so let's look at some of the components that actually game development goes into. So we have things like the scene, assets, code, and system. So now the scene, you remember I spoke about how the space actually plays quite a huge part in terms of game development. Now you have two types of scenes. You have a 2D and a 3D. So 2D is typically when the camera of the game is actually faced in one direction, where you can only see the player either moving left, right, or up and down. All right? And then the next one we have, it's actually called 3D, where we're actually introducing a different dimension, where we can actually see the top, the side, as well as the bottom. So it's essentially called left, right, and the top area. So this is typically how a 2D would look like, and this is how a typically 3D game would look like, right? So obviously most of us prefer playing more 3D-like games, but as a beginner, it's always safe to actually start developing your games in terms of 2D. Whew. Can I get off? All right, so let's talk about assets. So assets basically talk about all the things that actually are being involved in the game, right? So I'm talking about from the player, from how the player looks like. As you can see, so this typically, as you can see, has less graphical features than this one over here, all right? This character has the similar characteristics as that character over there. But it wouldn't make perfect sense if, let's say, Iron Man had to be placed in a game that looks like this. It doesn't make logical sense in that sense. So it's actually quite important to have the assets that actually work everything all together, right? The people, the water, the words, the background, and so forth. Now the code, right? So this is basically the brain of what the game is, right? So this is where everything then now happens. This is where the developers come together and actually make all of these objects come together. So we have to look at things like physics, gameplay, object-oriented programming, and so forth. Last but not least, we look at the system, right? So we try to develop a game, but for what kind of a console? Are we doing it for mobile? Are we doing it for PlayStation? Are we doing it for Nintendo? Is it a cross-platform, right? So these are the other things we have to take into consideration. The amount of RAM, the input, the plugs, the extensions, as well as the graphics. Right, another pillar that we're gonna talk about is game design, right? So this is basically like the artsy people, right? The creators of when it comes to gaming. They're the ones that actually, create the assets that I was talking about. They're the ones that actually make sure that everything actually that comprises and actually give you a realistic experience when it actually comes to gaming. Now, in design, you don't really have to be quite strong in programming, because the only thing you just have to do is just be good in terms of the creative side of things, right? So your multimedia, social media, game design, animation is also quite a key one as well. So now what exactly does a game designer do compared to a game developer? Well, as I said, depending on the company, depending on the size, essentially a designer actually works with all departments all across the globe, because they have to make sure that their designs actually have the look and feel and the appeal to what the gaming is all about. Right. So now let's look at the types of designers we actually get. We get system design. So system designs are the ones that will actually determine what platforms this game is going to be designed on. So then we have also a quest designer. So these are the people that deal with the kind of levels and different levels of actually a game is supposed to be. So for instance, if level 1 has 1 boss, level 2 will have probably 2 bosses, level 3 will have 3 bosses. Then we also have things like technical designs, right? So designers that will actually talk about certain features that certain characters will have, right? Certain enemies have certain capabilities, and so forth. So as you guys can see, there's a plethora of spaces where in terms of the design process that comes into play, right? So just a quick principles in terms of game development, right? So let's look at the player, right? So as a designer, I need to take the player into consideration, right? What is the role for the player, right? So how the actual player interacts with the game architecture. How does the player move within the whole space of the game, right? Then there is communication. There is communication. So communication in terms of how does the player actually communicate and interact with the assets as well. Special abilities, special powers. Does he have a shield? Does he have not? Then we also have the appeal, right? The game, the look and the feel of how the player actually is within the game. Another thing is the focus, right? So this is where the logic that comes in. So the focus is sometimes some of the games actually have some AI players in it. So if you play a game like FIFA, for instance, and you're playing alone, You also have AI players, right? So it will be yourself versus the PC or versus the console. So those is what we call AI players. And it's also quite important to make sure that the AI players don't feel or make the player feel like as if they are cheated or they are not actually making sense or enjoying the gameplay, right? Then there's progress. So progress basically deals with every single game actually has to have a progressive state, right? So in terms of level 1, level 2, level 3, so every single gamer actually wants to have an experience of how the game progresses through. Lastly, environment. So environment, I did touch up on it where it talks about the gameplay, right? So wide open spaces versus narrow, dark, and closed spaces. Right. So now, obviously, I spoke about quite a lot of things. I spoke about game development. I spoke about game architecture. I spoke about game design. So now, what happens then? Has any of you heard of esports? Probably some people have heard of esports. Are any of you guys involved in esports? No, not at all. All right. So what exactly is esports, right? So basically, esports is just a form of competitive gaming, but also just using video games, right? So think of the words sports. Traditionally, we know that like sports, usually it's between certain countries, certain regions, clubs, and so forth. But also now we can actually shift it into in the world of gaming as well. And this is where esports actually comes into play. So now I'm going to be talking about the difference between esports and gaming, right? So the word gaming basically means it's everybody that's actually partaking within the gaming space. So you might have people like streamers, right? They might not be in a competitive space, but they're also streaming their gaming. You can also have influencers, right? Endorsement deals. So these are the people that are just involved in the act of gaming themselves. Now, esports is taking gaming and obviously putting it in a more competitive arena, right? So will be an individual versus an individual, a team versus a team, or a country versus a country, right? So a lot of people mix up the word gaming and esports interchangeably, right? So whenever someone says, I'm a professional esports player, it means they're actually gaming, but more on a competitive professional level. Right. So now let's look at some of the careers that you can actually look into esports, right? So a lot of people think that esports is only about playing games, going to tournaments, winning tournaments, losing tournaments, and so forth. But it goes deeper than that, right? You can become a shoutcaster, so meaning you can become a host of all of these events that actually happen. You can go into PR. You can become an agent. You can become a referee. You can become an events manager. You can also become a professional esports player. So as you guys can see, there's a plethora of new industries that have actually opened within the esports realm, right? You can become a coach, you can become an analyst, you can become an organizer, you can become a funder, you can become a donator and anything. So there is quite a lot of advantages in actually getting into the whole esports field. Now let's look at the top games that actually have been released ever since 2020. That was the year of the lockdown, obviously. And then we've actually looked at Counter-Strike, for me personally, became number one because I thought that, I've got my own personal opinions about gaming, but this is basically the top 10, well, top 9 games that actually were either released or actually had a significant boom in terms of player interactivity as well as tournaments as well. So obviously, you guys know the popular ones like your Fortnite, Dota 2, Valorant, PUBG, as well as that. Now, some interesting facts about esports, right? So did you guys know that esports is the fourth biggest sporting event, the fourth biggest sporting revenue in the world, right? So this is after tennis, golf, and I think I forgot the third one, but yeah, it's basically the fourth biggest. So it's now not even a multi-billion dollar, it's actually a multi-trillion dollar industry, right? Because looking at how lockdown has affected a lot of people being at home and how we interact over the internet nowadays. Right now, currently, one of the richest esports players' current worth is worth $12 million. I don't know about you guys, but for me, that's a lot of money just playing games. All right, and most players obviously are known for just playing Dota 2, CSGO, Fortnite, League of Legends, and so forth. And some interesting ones is that we've actually seen investments from Drake, who actually has his own esports team called 100 Thieves. Snoop Dogg actually has a YouTube channel as well as Travis Scott, Ashton Kutcher, as well as Shaq O'Neal. So even celebrities are actually buying into the esports field. All right, so we've spoke about quite a lot, right? We spoke about developments, design, esports. So now what next? How does the future of gaming now look like, right? How are we now going to play with our games? How are we now going to interact with our games moving forth? And ladies and gentlemen, I want to now talk about the metaverse and AI gaming. And yes, I know it's a new buzzword that metaverse this, metaverse that, but I won't go too much into detail about it. But this is actually the trajectory and the direction where future of gaming is actually going into place. Now, as you guys can see that this person is wearing a VR set, and obviously in this exhibition, you've seen a couple of companies using AR devices as well. But actually, let's just talk about exactly what is it all about, right? So that a pure definition of what the metaverse is all about, right, is that it's trying to depict a futurism, right? Meaning how the future is going to look like through science fiction, right? And hypothetically, it iterates the interaction of the internet as well as the physical being all at the same time. So you've obviously heard things of like the virtual reality or the virtual world and so forth. So I know Meta, well, Facebook actually has something called Horizons, right? So they actually have different worlds like Horizon workspaces and so forth. So I don't want to go too much into it because I actually have a specific TikTok about metaverses and AI gaming, but I just wanted to actually just cover this in terms of the trajectory of how to actually we're going to start interacting with our gaming experiences. People don't want to only just play the game, they want to start feeling the game, right? They also want to start feeling and interacting with other people more on a personal level. So now we also have something called AI gaming as well. So this actually just means of responsive and adaptive to video games, actually using things like virtual reality and augmented reality sets, right? So as I said, you've probably seen some people wearing these fancy goggles, holding these equipment and so forth, and they're actually interacting with other people as if like they're not doing anything. But as time goes, and obviously as technology develops, we're going to actually start having bodysuits where you will actually feel the impact of, if you're actually in a fighting game, you'll actually feel the impact against your body. And as time goes, you'll actually be able to taste and actually smell how things are, right? So this is basically how the future of gaming is actually going to look like. And in closing, these are basically one of the top companies that are working in the metaverse, right? So as I said, Facebook is working on something called Horizons. I know that also Roblox is actually quite a popular one that's emerging as well. But these are just obviously and some of the companies that are also trying to invest within the metaverse state. And ladies and gentlemen, this comes to the end of my tech talk. Yeah, and I'm willing to take questions. And please do connect with me if there's any questions, anything you're interested about in terms of gaming as a whole, Python gaming. And yeah, those are my details. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Koketso, for that great talk. Do we have any questions? Yes, right here.
Hi. So great speech, first of all.
Thank you, thank you.
Seriously, thank you. And I admire that you talked about Pygame. Does Pygame, like, can it handle the big games like Call of Duty, Fortnite, and so on? Can it handle making such games, or is it just made for small games such as mobile apps?
Yeah. So Pygame actually, it's very okay. No, right? It cannot handle such big games like that because games like Call of Duty and so forth, as I said, it's more of three dimensions, right? You need bigger developers, you need bigger graphics, you need bigger designers and so forth. Pygame is only designed for, especially for beginners that want to get into game development. That's why you can only design arcade kind of games, right? So your Pac-Man, Space Invaders, and so forth. So That's what basically Pi Game is. But with Pi Game, it actually teaches you the fundamentals of how game development actually is. So you'll look in terms of object-oriented programming, right? So you'll have the same classes of a player game, but the player can have different features as well. You know, you can have the difference between a player and an enemy. You can look at sprites, right? You can also classify that as a class, but and then you can obviously have different attributes that are assigning to it.
Okay, and regarding the metaverse, you talked about how games are coming up like Roblox are taking over the metaverse, VR sets, augmented reality. Now, how can we approach that as students, let's say? We want to approach the metaverse, we want to go on further with it and actually develop games for the metaverse. How can we approach that using, other than Pygame, of course, because Pygame cannot handle that. So how can we approach it?
All right, so as I said, I mean, I do have another TikTok on all of that, but I remember Mark Zuckerberg did actually say that they're actually starting to introduce free courses for developers and designers to actually be more involved in the metaverse itself. Because the whole aim of metaverse is that they're trying to create a platform where it can be cross worlds, right? So let's say Amazon has its own platform and world, and Facebook has its own platform and world, but your assets and your profile, should I say, can actually be able to interact and transfer between both, right? So, but that's like future things to come. But for now, everything is still under development, under research, and so forth. So I know right now there's not a lot of content around the metaverse itself because it's still quite a new concept that a lot of people are still trying to grasp. So, I personally, what I would say is that just personally do your research, especially around Meta, which is Facebook, because they're providing all of the trainings that they actually are providing now.
I don't think this is working. But I was going to say that I would be interested to, I think a lot of the game development stuff right now is in C#, in Unity still. So a lot of like stuff for augmented reality and VR is all C# at the moment. But it would be great to hear more about like Python stuff in this space as well.
Yeah.
So thank you for that talk. Do we have any more questions or? Thank you very much. Oh, one more question actually, right there.
Thank you. Gaming is hyper competitive. I'm not just talking about, gaming itself, but game development. Is there talent in Africa in general and South Africa to compete globally? And can you give some examples of games coming out of Africa or South Africa? Please.
Sorry, I didn't quite get the last part of your question. Something about South African competitive gaming?
No. I mean, game development
Okay.
is competitive.
Yeah.
Are there games coming out of Africa in general and South Africa in particular? Do you have any examples?
All right, so in terms of game development in Africa and in South Africa, I think maybe you can also take a testament is that we don't really have a big talent pool in terms of game development, but the esports industry is quite big. Let me just specify in South Africa firstly, right? I mean, I've worked with a company called Goliath Gaming, which is actually one of the biggest esports companies in Africa, right? So I've actually hosted some workshops for them in terms of game development and such forth. So we haven't really seen any big or major games that actually come from the African space, because obviously with us, the technology is a bit, redundant and so forth. And number two, I think it's not about the talent, but I think also the source of knowledge, right? So people don't actually have the access to that information quite as easily as other regions. So off the top of my head, I don't even think there's actually been a African game that's actually well-renownedly played worldwide, But I do know that some countries actually have their own indigenous games that have been developed within their actual countries as well.
Awesome. I think that's all the time we have. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you very much.